exactly to this day, well, 2 weeks ago, 4 years ago today, a man named Stephen Paul Jobs died of cancer. Steve Jobs was the founder of two of the most remarkable companies in the history of any companies that have ever been founded. Apple Computer, now called just Apple. And do you know what his other company was, by the way? Anybody know? Pixar, the movie studio Pixar. The maker of my favorite movies of all time, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, WALL-E, and a bunch of other ones, except for Cars 2. That was a real disappointment. But other than that, see, you have to speak the truth. Steve Jobs was an image bearer, an extraordinarily creative human being who sparked creativity in other people. Almost all of us in this room, all of us in this country, have been shaped by what he and the teams that he led created. Those stories that you see on film in Pixar, those devices that almost no one brought their device up. Look at this. This is disappointing to me. Anyone else want to contribute a device? You guys came up. Well, those devices that are lurking in your back pockets or in your laps, or maybe they're back in your room, all shaped by what he led. And in many ways, what Steve Paul Jobs created was flourishing. In many ways, what he created was beautiful, useful. It ordered the world in ways that led to abundance. Millions of people probably have jobs and work to do because of what Steve Jobs helped to invent. Truly, in many ways, an image bearer. But he also had an idol. Steve Jobs had an idol. And oddly enough, even though the symbol of his best-known company was the bitten fruit, Steve Jobs' idol was not technology. Steve Jobs actually had a very healthy relationship with technology. It didn't take over his life in the way that idols threaten to. And in fact, his family had a very healthy relationship with technology. He didn't let his kids have iPhones or iPads. He wanted them to experience the world unfiltered, unmediated. So in his own home, the devices that fill up our homes were hardly present. He really had a healthy relationship with technology. It wasn't his idol, but Steve Jobs had an idol. And we only know about this because after his death, his biographer, Walter Isaacson, published a very candid biography, authorized biography. And in that, we learned what Steve Jobs' idol was. His idol was food. What does an idol promise its worshipers? Do you remember? What does it promise? Authority without vulnerability. What are the two promises every idol makes? Number one, you shall be like God. Number two, you shall not surely die. And Steve Jobs turned to food to give him this godlike power and this very, actually, ungodlike invulnerability. When he was a teenager, how many of you are 17 years old at this moment? Couple? When Steve Jobs was 17 years old, he and a friend went to an apple farm in Washington State. Lots of farms on the eastern side of the mountains in Washington that grow apples. And this was the 1960s, and people were doing weird things back then, you might have heard. And one of the weird things they were doing was really raw, extreme raw diets. And so people were experimenting with all kinds of, in retrospect, not very healthy diets. And what Steve Jobs tried out for 2 weeks on this apple farm was eating only apples. For 2 weeks, all he ate as a 17-year-old were apples. And the idea was that if you would kind of embrace these raw diets, that they would kind of cleanse your body, give you kind of capacities you didn't have, and it actually worked for Steve Jobs. He found that the longer he was on this raw fruit diet, the more control he felt over his body and his environment. Steve Jobs had a famously piercing gaze. And some people said he kind of walked around with a reality distortion field. He could tell you something and make you believe it. And he had himself photographed in this picture with this kind of direct gaze. And he found, as he day after day ate only apples, that he had this kind of elevated sense of control in personal relationships. He could just stare someone in the eye and maintain eye contact with them and kind of control the conversation, control the emotions, control the relationship. And he found that he had this kind of ecstatic sense of not needing to sleep very much, having tons of energy, being incredibly able to do whatever he wanted to do. And at that moment in Steve Jobs' life, food started to become his idol. And for the rest of his life, he had what Isaacson calls in his book an eating disorder. And an eating disorder is just a clinical way of saying a disordered relationship with food in which we ask food to give us authority without vulnerability. And so at many points in his life, Steve Jobs would get involved in these kind of crazy diets, sometimes raw food, sometimes vegan, sometimes vegetarian. He would complain about the food that was served him. It started to disrupt his relationships with other people. He'd walk into some of the finest restaurants in the world and walk out halfway through the meal, storm out of the restaurant because the food wasn't exactly like he wanted it to be. He'd actually walk away from dinner with his own family in his own home when the chef hadn't prepared the food the way he wanted it. Food was Steve Jobs' way of having control over his life, his relationships, and his world. And nobody knew this about him except maybe his closest family. In October of 2003, if I remember the year correctly, Steve Jobs went for a kind of routine medical exam. And the doctor said, we found troubling evidence of something not right with your pancreas, and we want to do additional tests. So they did some more tests. And when they came back with the test results, his doctors had tears in their eyes. Tears of joy. They said, in one way, our fears were confirmed. You have pancreatic cancer. But the amazing thing is you have a specific kind of pancreatic cancer called islet cell pancreatic cancer. And it's the one kind of pancreatic cancer that we are almost positive we know how to cure. They said, you are a very lucky man. You know, I don't know if you've had grandparents or other relatives. I had my grandfather-in-law died of pancreatic cancer. Normally, it's a very swift death sentence, but not islet cell pancreatic cancer because it grows very slowly. It remains confined to one part of that organ. And they said, all we need to do is perform something called the modified Whipple procedure, where we'll take out a piece of your pancreas. It's not a terribly complex surgery, and we have every reason to believe you'll live out the rest of your life cancer-free. Steve Jobs walked out of that examining room, and for the next year, decided to try to treat his cancer with food. So he went to these quack, I don't know whether they called themselves doctors, people who claimed to be able to cure cancer with really odd diets. And he went to people all around the world who claimed that they knew a diet that would cure cancer, and he tried to eat his way into health from that disease. His family and his friends pleaded with him to have the operation, but his widow, Lorraine Jobs, told Walter Isaacson, his biographer, Steve didn't want to let anyone have control over his body. He didn't want to let a surgeon open up his body. Every idol, what idols promise is control. That's what authority without vulnerability is. That's what control is. And so Steve Jobs wouldn't give over control to the best surgeons in the world. And for a year, he tried to treat his cancer with food as he got sicker and sicker. After a year, he gave in to his family's and his friends' pleadings, and he had the surgery. But by that point, the cancer had grown and had spread outside the pancreas. And he was never again cancer-free. And those of us who lived through this time watched this amazing image bearer continue with his team to develop beautiful, wonderful things in many ways. But at every appearance, he would look thinner and thinner. And people said, well, it's because of the cancer treatment. No, it was actually because even as he was being treated for cancer, Steve Jobs was still turning to diets that actually prevented the cancer treatments from working. He wouldn't eat enough protein for his body to be able to recover from the chemotherapy. And in January of 2011, he announced his stepping away from Apple as he got sicker and sicker. And in October 2011, he died, leaving his teenage children as orphans, as fatherless, and his wife a widow. When I said that idols promise everything and demand nothing, but end up delivering nothing and demanding everything, that wasn't in a manner of speaking. That wasn't just kind of a metaphor. Idols really will take your life. They will not necessarily take your life right away. Idols work at first. On that apple farm, just to pause, you just can't make this stuff up, right? That Steve Jobs named his company after the thing that was his path to playing God, his path to being like God. And when he was 17, it seemed like it worked. And for a long time, it seemed like it worked. It actually was working less and less well. And eventually, that idol that had promised Steve Jobs everything delivered nothing and took everything, not just from him, but from his whole family. And in many ways from his company, and in a way from all of us who could otherwise have benefited from whatever he might have helped to create in 20, 30 more years of healthy, active life. So one of the most important things you can do in your life is spot idols early and not let them get a grip on your heart and your mind and your body. So I want to give you a few early warning signs of idols. I want you to know how to recognize an idol before it has taken over your life so much that you're a slave to it and that you'd even try to cure cancer with it. So here's a few ways you can know that something in your life is becoming an idol. And by the way, I'll talk about this first line in a second. All these things are potentially good things. Food is good. It's even very good. It's just when you use it to give you authority without vulnerability that it becomes an idol. Everything that becomes an idol is in principle good. But when it starts to become an idol, here's how you start to know. Number one way idols start to show up is they disrupt your relationships with your family, with your friends, and with God. Because idols do not care about relationships because they are not people. The true God is a person. The true God is actually a community of persons, 3 in 1. There is nothing more important to God than the love between Father, Son, and Spirit, and the love between the creator of the world and his own creation. Love is the prime directive of the whole cosmos. But idols are inanimate, impersonal. They couldn't care less about your relationships. And so the moment an idol starts to work its way into your life, you start to sense that your relationships are getting thinner and more fragile. An idol replaces prayer. You start kind of devoting your thought life and attention and imagination and hopes and dreams to this thing or person or whatever it is. And you find yourself not so interested in connecting with the one who made you and loves you like a father. An idol prevents you from caring for the vulnerable. Because the whole point of an idol is to keep you from being vulnerable. So why would you voluntarily go near to people who are themselves vulnerable, who are materially poor, who don't act or talk like the rest of us, who have profound needs that some of us don't have, who make us feel uncomfortable, who maybe make us feel out of our depth like we wouldn't know how to help? An idol will help you never care again about the vulnerable around you, because it's all about minimizing vulnerability. I really appreciated what Samantha said about how popularity can become an idol. And part of the way popularity becomes an idol is it starts to demand that you only spend your time with people more popular than you are. And so you're constantly scanning the room to make sure you're with the right people, because you're afraid that if you step outside that circle, that charmed circle, that you'll be excluded from it forever. And suddenly, all kinds of pain, hurt, openness, possibility to discover God and the gospel, possibility to become maybe some of your best friends, people who might not look like the coolest people, could end up being your best friends, but you'll never go near them because you're worshiping the idol of that charm circle. What else? Oh, yeah, this is a good one. Idols make bargains. They love to bargain with you. So the serpent says, well, if you just eat a little bit of this fruit, guess what's going to happen? It's always a trade. Idols always say, worship me a little bit more and I'll give you this little thing. Take a sip of this, you'll have this experience. This is totally not like the true God. The true God does not make bargains. He makes covenants. And a covenant is a one-way unilateral declaration. You're my beloved son. You're my beloved daughter. With you I am well pleased. I am going to rescue you from sin and death and bring you into true life. Idols never talk that way. They always say, I think we can make a deal. And so one of the ways you know you're worshiping an idol is you start sort of bargaining with it. You're like, well, I'll give this a little more time, or I'll give it another chance, and maybe it'll work. It's not how the true God operates. The true God doesn't make bargains. He makes unconditional promises of love. Idols have no interest in unconditional promises. They don't make them. Idols get impatient. They ask you for more and more of your time, more and more of your attention and imagination. And they start getting really nervous when you're not worshiping them. The way that I know when I'm getting addicted to my little, I like to call it my idol, lowercase I, get it? Idol? Yeah, that's exactly how my kids react when I make that joke. It's very disappointing. The way I know this thing is becoming an idol for me is when I start feeling nervous when I haven't kind of caressed it recently. It's like, oh, I better just, in fact, maybe I'll just, oh, look, I have an email. Oh, shouldn't have done that. There's this sense of, oh, I just need to check it. And it's getting more impatient. The longer it sits in this box, the more nervous I'm getting about it. Do you know, every day I am acutely conscious of the battery level of my iPhone? I walk around with this constant awareness. I think I'm down to about 30%. And I was in India, in the nation of India, and I would see in these homes, people would have, every home in India, every traditional home, Hindu home, has a little corner where the family gods are, representations of the idols that family serves, the gods that family serves. And there's always a little piece of food and a little bit of incense there for the god. And somehow, every day, someone remembers to feed the god. Because Indian gods are a lot like Babylonian gods. They need human beings to kind of give them reverence and respect and attention and a little bit of food every day. And I realized this is exactly what I do with my little god. I make sure every night I give it the food it needs, and I'm very aware. It's not a big deal necessarily, but when that little battery icon gets red, you know, the last little red sliver, suddenly my idol is getting impatient, and I get nervous. The true God never gets impatient with you. The true God never says, why haven't you fed me in a while? God is not getting nervous because you're not praying. He just misses you. That's all. And he's just waiting for you to come back, but he doesn't need anything from you. God is not out to get anything, to extract or exploit anything from you. How do you know you're dealing with an idol? Because it offers you diminishing returns. At first, it's great. But over time, the returns are less and less. It's giving you less and less satisfaction. I remember the day my son got his Facebook account at age 13. We were legit. We played by the rules. And how excited he was to get on Facebook. And Facebook can be a really good thing, and it's been a good thing in some ways for my son. But in the course of high school, Timothy found that Facebook was delivering less and less satisfaction, was demanding more and more time, was actually disrupting relationships, was causing people to be meaner to one another and short-tempered with each other, impatient with each other in ways they actually wouldn't be in person. And I think wisely, for his own choice, my son, when he went off to college, closed his account. It's so funny. At the beginning of high school, he was like, oh, this is so awesome. I've been waiting like all of junior high for this. And now that he's 18 and off to college, he's like, oh man, that just produced diminishing returns. Like the longer I used it, the less I got out of it. The true God is totally the opposite of this. The true God gets better and better over time. So the number one best thing about being 47 years old, which is how old I am, is I have 30 years on you guys. I sat where you sat when I was 17. I had just become a Christian when I was 17. And God seemed good then. God is so much better now, 30 years later, than God was then. I want to tell you, every adult in this room is here because Jesus has been better and better as life has gone on. No idol is going to treat you that way. No idol will treat you that way. It'll treat you great on day one, but it's going to get worse and worse. The true God gets better and better. Let me look at my notes. I can't remember what I'm going to say next. Oh, one more thing. Idols lead you to shame and secrecy. They don't really want anyone else to know about this relationship. Let's let it just be you and me on the down low, says the idol. They want to isolate you. And the most powerful way to be isolated is through shame and secrecy. The true God wants to draw you out of that into real, true, wholehearted, open life. No idol cares about that. So if you find yourself with anything in your life, I think it might be helpful for me to tell you what mine were when I was your age. My idols when I was your age. I made a list, but it's not on my screen. Let me see if I can remember. I know my number one because junior high, you'll be really surprised to hear, was hard for me. I'm sure that's never happened to any of you, but junior high was not that much fun. And it was not fun for me because I was skinny and I had glasses and other kids teased me. And so I had a way of dealing with other kids teasing me, which is I told myself something in my head to kind of deal with the sense of vulnerability in those painful encounters. I think now they call it bullying. Back then it was just what kids did. I would say to myself, this is terrible. I don't like this. But I would tell myself, I'm smart. Or I'm smarter than they are. And I would feel, it would give me this sense of, I don't know how to respond, I don't know how to defend myself, how to deal with all the pain I'm feeling at school, but I'm smart. And I started to hold on to my intelligence as my idol. It gave me a sense of authority and it limited my sense of vulnerability. Now, this is kind of ridiculous because I really have nothing to do with how smart I am or am not. I mean, it's totally just whatever I have is a gift, right? I didn't work for it. I can't really make myself that much smarter. There are ways to make yourself dumber. There are not that many ways to make yourself smarter. There was nothing I could take credit for, and I started using it to sort of shore up my sense of security, and it kind of worked for a while. But then I found it started to disrupt my relationships. I started to become arrogant in my intelligence, and it started to make me distance myself from other people. And then I started to feel insecure about not being smart enough when I moved to another school district, and there were some really smart kids there who seemed smarter than me. And suddenly this thing which had been my source of authority was now my source of vulnerability. And one of the things I had to learn, and I think I learned it kind of during college, was just to totally let go of that and not worship that anymore. And I really don't anymore. And I am smart. Like, I am. I can't help it. If I were also good looking, I would really be in trouble, right? But fortunately, I only got one of the two. But it's true. But I don't turn to it for authority anymore. And I don't turn to it to relieve me from vulnerability. My authority and my vulnerability are that I'm a beloved son of God, not that I might be intelligent. Number two was, I'll just talk about one other, and it's kind of obvious, but it was every girl before my wife, Catherine, who I got involved with. And the reason they were idols, they were all amazing people. And every relationship that I had before my relationship with the woman who's now my wife was completely infected with idolatry because it was all about me. It wasn't really about Debbie or Karen or Judy, who were the three main ones. They were all, well, did not include Will for some reason. Debbie, my relationships with them were so much about how I felt when I was with them. It had almost nothing to do with my ability to extend myself and love these girls and young women. It was all about how being with them made me feel better about myself and less vulnerable. That's a terrible basis for a relationship. And actually, those relationships disrupted my other relationships. I became completely obsessed with each of them in turn. And they could feel it. And it actually, my disordered relationship with them started to disrupt even our own relationship. And they all ended horribly. And it was all my fault every time. Because I wasn't treating them like people. They were my idols. And then I grew out of this in some ways, had to repent of all this, prayed through this with friends. And one day I met this woman named Catherine Hirschfeld, young woman named Catherine. And we started to have a real friendship. And we talked about what was most deeply important to us. We had both been shaped by following Jesus. Both of us had come to faith not from families that believed. And we had that in common. We had both worked in the African American church. Both of us had worked in the black church. And neither of us was black, both white, as we call it in America. And so both of us had kind of learned what it was to humble yourself and not be the majority. And I remember having these long conversations with her about all these things and how amazing it was to follow Jesus, to step out of your comfort zone, all this stuff. And one day I'm like, wow, this would be an amazing person to have as like a wife. And fortunately, she was thinking the same thing. And very quickly, with none of the obsession, none of the anxiety, none of the kind of ickiness that I remember from all my other relationships, and none of the sexual addiction. None of the sense of, oh my gosh, we went too far. Oh, that was woo. Or, I can't stop thinking about that. Just the most natural development of appropriate physical intimacy as we made commitments to each other and invited our friends and family to help us make a commitment. I was given the most amazing gift of my life, which is my wife, Catherine. Because she wasn't my idol. She was a person given to me by God at the right time. That can be true for you too. And it can also be true if that person doesn't ever come along. God is going to be so good to you. Don't miss it. We have seen one of the most astonishing examples of idolatry in the last 2 weeks with a company called Volkswagen. Volkswagen, that's the way they say it in German, the people's car. It had become the people's car. Last year is the #1 car manufacturer in the world. Beat out Toyota and GM, its two largest competitors. Have you followed what's happened with Volkswagen? With their diesel cars? So here's the deal. Volkswagen wants to develop what they call clean diesel. It's diesel that doesn't emit nitrous oxide when it's burned, or that is sufficiently scrubbed that very dangerous pollutant that causes lung cancer, especially in metropolitan areas, that there's a new way, they said, to have diesel cars that doesn't emit that. It's very high mileage, very good for the environment. They wanted to present this as the new clean green car. And so Volkswagen got approval to sell these diesel vehicles, and they were doing great. And then 2 weeks ago, we found out that the only reason they were doing great is that their computer chips inside that control the engine had a way to tell when it was being tested for nitrous oxide emissions by the government. This was completely secret. It's called a defeater. And it would sense the test conditions, and it would change the way the engine functioned so that it would seem like it was producing very little nitrous oxide. And it actually was not producing much at that time. But as soon as you stopped testing the car, it would go back to operating in its really high power way, but it would start spewing out nitrous oxide again. Completely illegal. Millions of cars have been sold with this technology under the false claim that they were clean and safe for the environment, when in fact they're more dangerous than the previous generation of diesel cars. So this is what is on NPR. They ran this story, and I read it just this afternoon. And just think about this. One of the largest car companies in the world is now on the ropes because a few people in that company decided we're going to lie and defeat the test and pretend we're producing clean cars when we're actually producing dirty cars. So, Carl, this is in the middle of an NPR story. I'm just going to read you a couple lines because I think it shows idolatry in action. Carl's a taxi driver in Germany that NPR interviewed. He once worked on VW's production line, and he was shocked by revelations that the company had been cheating. Yes, I'm very surprised about this kind of criminal act, he said. It's incredible what they have done. I can't understand, he says. Lots of people, especially Germans, are asking why VW management would risk everything in this way. Why would you risk everything? Because you're worshiping an idol that started out promising a lot and asking very little, but gradually demands more and more. Did VW start out to risk everything? Absolutely not. But now, listen to what happened. Uwe Jean Heuser, the economics editor of the German weekly Die Zeit, has a theory. VW wanted to become the biggest car maker in the world very quickly. You will be like God, producing more cars than any other company, faster than any other company. And there were a couple of dominant people at the top. And this created this deceitful endeavor. The name of these two men were Ferdinand Piëch and Martin Winterkorn. These two wanted to change VW's path. They wanted to be the #1 car maker in the world, and they did everything for that to happen. And what they did was lie in a way that now is costing them everything. The world of work is full of idols. And the idols always promise, just take this shortcut, just adjust this program a little bit, and you'll be able to be #1. You'll be like God. You'll be the God of the auto industry. You'll make more money, sell more cars than anyone ever did, and just do this make this one little adjustment. But idols never work in the long run. It always gets found out in the long run. They always stop working. And now it's stopped working for VW. And literally millions of people are affected by this. The hundreds of thousands who will literally get lung cancer because of this. The millions of workers for VW and all the companies that work for it who wonder, are we going to have a job in a year? Because a few people worshipped an idol. And we're not willing to just be creatures trying to make better cars, but want to be like gods who make cars that do what cars actually can't do. So this is the world we're in. A world where we're supposed to have image bearers who act with authority and vulnerability. See, it's vulnerable to say, I don't know how to make a diesel car that actually doesn't pollute. Maybe we can't. But what if you could just pretend that's not a problem and just have the authority without the vulnerability? So a bunch of people have chosen idolatry. But what idolatry always produces in the long run is poverty. It promises you authority without vulnerability. It delivers vulnerability without authority. And then a few people live down here in safety. So I want to talk about one more thing that happens up and to the left. And then I actually want to talk about how this could get turned around and turned right. But let me just talk for a minute about injustice. Because injustice is the other form of authority without vulnerability. What would be the ultimate form of injustice in the world of work? Slavery. How many people are slaves in the world today? Do you know?
Still a lot.
The International Labor Organization says 31 million people are slaves today. And what it is to be a slave is that you are coerced by force or by violence or threat of violence. You're not paid a suitable wage, and you're not free to leave. So this is the worst thing that can happen in the world of work, is to be a slave. And there are 31 million people who are slaves in the world. And that is more people than were trafficked across the Atlantic in the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. So today, there are more slaves today than were trafficked across the Atlantic in 400 years of the heinous evil of slavery in our own continent and country. And I got to meet some of these slaves thanks to a man named Jaikumar Christian. Jaikumar is the head of World Vision in the country of India. And I got World Vision is a Christian humanitarian organization. I got to travel with him on a train to a village called Kalangiam in southern India, where, when World Vision started working, 80% of school-aged children were slaves. So many of the slaves in the world are children. And in this village, they had a list on the wall of one of their community centers of the children who had been slaves. Now, they've been released, so I'm going to tell you good news about how people get out of slavery in the modern world. But when World Vision started working, each of these kids, there's 20 kids listed here, each of them was a slave, and they were taken out of school. They were exploited by their masters. They were not getting paid a living wage or a just wage for their work. And a man who will exploit a child for labor will exploit a child for anything, honestly. So these children were living in desperate conditions. And you would ask, why? How can this be happening? This is completely illegal in India, by the way. But the slave owners are connected to the police and to the judges, and so they get away with it, or they were getting away with it. And here's how it would work. A poor family who had very little money, very little resources, would have some urgent financial need. Maybe it's a medical crisis. Maybe it's a wedding in the family for which honor requires you pay a lot of money to put on a good wedding. They'd go to a local small businessman and get a loan. But the loan is for interest rates of like 200 or 300% per year. It's a usurious loan is the word for it. And so they get the loan, they spend it on what they need, but now the interest payments start to come due, and there's no way that a very poor family in a village in India can pay back the interest, let alone the principal. So the demands escalate and escalate, and one day the henchmen of this small businessman moneylender come to the door and they say, you're not paying back the loan. We could go to the judge and get you thrown in jail for your default on your loan. But there's that 8-year-old back there in the back of the house. What's she doing? If you send her to work for the moneylender, he'll apply her wages to your loan, and you'll gradually pay it back. Now, this is actually a lie. What's going to happen when she gets to the moneylender's shop and moves in with him in the backyard, usually, not even in the house, is that not only is he not really going to add her wages, he's actually going to start adding a charge for room and board to the family's bill. So their bill is actually going to grow faster once the child is enslaved. But the poor family, often they don't really understand. They're often illiterate. They don't necessarily understand what their options are, what's going on. And so this feels like the only thing they can do. So they send their child to work for this moneylender. And their bill just grows and grows, and these children are taken out of school and in every way robbed of dignity and the opportunity to bear the image of God. And as Jai Kumar described this system to me, so let me give you a couple examples. So Prabhu worked in a cycle shop. This is not bicycles, this is motorcycles, and it's dirty, dangerous work repairing motorcycles. That's what Prabhu was doing every day, 7 days a week, never allowed to go to school, for a bondage amount of 3,000 rupees. That was the original loan was for 3,000 rupees. At the time that I took this picture and visited India 4 years ago, that was $50. So this retreat costs your family or whoever paid for it $65 per kid, right? So for that amount, a family couldn't come up with that money, and for that amount, their son, Prabhu, was now sent to work in this motorcycle shop as a slave. And their bill was growing and growing. Bhubalan, I think that's a girl's name if I'm not mistaken, for the same amount, ended up weaving at a loom, was working weaving. This is really dangerous work for kids. Their fingers get caught in the loom, their hands get arthritic very early. Ganti was, for 2,000 rupees, that's like 35 bucks, was rolling matches, which they called beedies, little handmade, not matches, cigarettes, little handmade cigarettes. And I realized what was happening. This family was very vulnerable, but they needed some authority. They needed some capacity to act in the form of a loan. And the moneylender says, okay, I'll give you the loan, and it won't cost very much at the beginning. But quickly, the benefits of the loan diminish, and eventually that money is spent and goes away. And now the demands escalate, and now no benefits are left for the loan, and now the moneylender demands everything. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is the same thing as an idol. Instead of a thing promising everything, demanding nothing, but then eventually delivering nothing and demanding everything, it's a person. And injustice describes a world in which a few people can take authority without vulnerability at the expense of other people living in poverty. And so I met some of these kids, and a year before I met them, they had been slaves. These two boys, who might have been Prabhu and his brother, I don't know. And then these girls, the one in the middle was named Sonia. I'm going to tell you her story in a minute. Now they were free, but before World Vision got involved, they'd been slaves. So here's a question for you. I'd like you to talk with your neighbor about this. Where in your world, where you live and work and study, do you see people gaining authority without vulnerability at the expense of other people having vulnerability without authority? Where do you see injustice in the world around you? So turn to a neighbor to talk about where do you see this pattern of authority without vulnerability leading to vulnerability without authority? You might learn, right? But doesn't it gets worse as the year goes on, usually. Whereas the best teachers, the class gets better and better because everybody's flourishing as that person uses their power in the right way. So that can happen. What about somebody from the back, my back Left, you're back right. Yeah.
Like gambling, the people that own like the casinos are kind of taking advantage of people that are.
Wow. So gambling itself can be an idol, and see, idols and injustice are connected. Because if you can set up a system that sort of benefits from people's tendency to get addicted to gambling, you can rake in a lot of money, but it's at the expense of people who are literally impoverishing themselves and their families. And there is something about gambling. I don't know, it's always wrong at a very low level to have fun by sort of adding an element of stakes to a card game or something. But when it gets organized, it becomes about the exploitation of people, inevitably. And it produces nothing. It doesn't produce anything of economic value. It just extracts. And that's another sign of idols. Idols and injustice produce nothing of lasting value. Great example. What about from this section? How about Andy? Because Samantha says a lot of awesome things, but Andy has said half as many awesome things. So catch up. Out loud. I'm giving you another shot.
I thought maybe how in DirecTV bills they jack the prices up.
DirecTV. They start out with like these introductory offers that are very low, but then the price keeps going up. It could, well, absolutely. Companies can use these kind of systems to get you hooked, right? And are you getting more and more pleasure from that thing? Maybe not, but the price keeps going up. Yeah, great. All right. Kai, you also say a ton. How about just trying to spread the love a little bit.
I was going to say McDonald's.
McDonald's. Yeah, okay. No, all right, so hear it out.
Shane wants to answer the question. Since he's so good. Answer the question, Stephen.
No,
Answer the question.
All right, so Presslot, what is it about McDonald's that can be a kind of injustice?
Prices on the dollar menu used to be an actual dollar.
This is what we must suffer, people. The dollar menu is now $1.19. Rise up, revolution!
Leave on the Big Mac.
All right, one more. Yes. Sam. Sorry, a little louder. Social workers.
Yeah, they can control the way parents raise their children or they rent.
Wow. So at its best, social work is a way of actually protecting the vulnerable, but at its worst, it can absolutely become a power trip that actually breaks up families, disrupts relationships in ways that actually don't lead to health. And again, any good thing can turn into an idol. Any good system can turn into injustice when the people who have power in it use it to give themselves authority without vulnerability. So this is the world we're in. And I gave you this picture earlier, but let me show it one more time. It's a world where, well, that is not the picture I wanted to show you. I do want to show you this picture, but not yet. Sorry. It's like the technology breakdown. Hang on. So this is the world we're in, where idolatry and injustice have generated poverty. If you see poverty in the world, it is not because human beings are naturally poor or unable to care for or provide for themselves. Everyone who is materially poor is an image bearer of God. And in the right conditions, if you traded places with them, they could flourish in all the ways you may be flourishing. It's that they're caught in systems of idolatry and injustice, while some of us can retreat to safety. And the question is, what happened to the image? So in the last few minutes with you, I want to talk about how the image gets restored. The amazing claim of the Christian gospel is that the true image bearer came back into the story. And in some Christian traditions, we make what are called icons. An icon is a trustworthy image. An idol is a false image of God. An icon is something that tells you something true about God. And this is an icon of Jesus from the Greek Orthodox Church. And Jesus came into the world to restore the image of God in the world. Jesus comes into a story where all there is to see in the world is idolatry and injustice, safety and poverty. And he acts with complete authority and also opens himself up to complete vulnerability. And interestingly, the icon maker actually put this into the icon, the two sides of Jesus, his authority and his vulnerability. And they're in the two sides of his face in this picture. So most faces are basically symmetrical, but Jesus' face in this icon is slightly different, and it's to show the two sides of who he is. If you hold up your left hand so that you only see the left side of Jesus' own face, so you're looking at the right side as you look at it, is that what kind of, how would you describe the expression of that face? Stern. I think that's a wonderful word for it. His eyebrow is arched. It's an authoritative face because Jesus is the Lord of the world. But then hold your other hand up so that you only see Jesus' right side of his face on your left. And what kind of face is that? Maybe tired, maybe a little sad, compassionate. Do you see that he has two expressions? So the reason for this is that Jesus is both fully authority, he's Lord of the world, and that's the stern side of Jesus, because the Lord of the world looks at a world where his image has been lost, and he says, what has happened to my image? He's angered by the loss of his image. He pronounces judgment on those who have abused people made in his image. But on the other side, we see the Jesus who is completely open to the world, who's totally compassionate towards the world. And this Jesus went to the point of complete vulnerability for us. One of the things that the Western art tradition has shied away from completely depicting, and Chamboué in this altarpiece kind of avoids it a little bit himself, is that the Romans crucified their victims naked. Because that's the ultimate way to shame a human being, to impale them on a cross completely naked. Jesus wore nothing on the cross, in spite of what we show in our crucifixes in our churches. And what is it to be naked on a cross? That is the ultimate vulnerability. No one in this room has gotten to high school without moments of great shame, without moments of great sense of vulnerability, wounds, exposure. Jesus knows that. He experienced, honestly, worse than that. Because he bore all of that vulnerability on the cross. And he even descended to death, the ultimate vulnerability without authority. And he's now raised from the dead. He's now present with us. He now raises us from our own suffering, shame, slavery. And he wants to set you free to restore his image in the world. So I want to pray for you. And I want to tell you the story of what happened to Sonia in India. And here's how I want to pray. Jeff, can we lower the lights almost all the way? So Jesus, who was all authority, who took on all vulnerability, is, by his promise, present in this room. Now, by his grace, we don't see him because we would be overwhelmed, and our current state would be completely overcome if we were to see him face to face at this moment. But he is here. And Jesus, we believe you want to make yourself known to us right now. And I want to pray for this group in three ways. I want to pray for the three corners that we all live in that are not true image bearing. So I want to start by praying if you're in the poverty corner. That means that you have known and you know right now a lot of vulnerability with no authority. And what I want to ask you to do as I go through these three corners is, if this applies to you, I want everybody just to keep their eyes closed. It's not about your neighbor. It's just about you. My eyes are closed. The leader's eyes are closed. But if you would especially like prayer as someone who finds yourself with vulnerability without authority, with the shame and suffering and poverty that come from being in that corner, I'd invite you to stand up, and I'm just going to say a short prayer over you. I'm not going to call you out or even see who you are. But God will see, and God knows where you are. So if you especially want prayer as someone who lives down and to the right, in that place of poverty, in whatever sense of that word applies to you, just quietly you can stand. I'm going to pray for all of us, because we've all been there. Jesus, I am so grateful I'm standing because I've been in this corner. That for those of us who have experienced vulnerability without authority, that you went there. That you are with us in this. That you descended all the way to the dead. And so for any of us who find ourselves trapped in a place where we're so exposed to risk but don't feel like we can act, you are with us in that place. And I pray that you would strengthen my sisters and my brothers to know your power to lift them out in your time into the image bearing they were made for. And I pray that they would know you as their deepest, best friend who knows everything about them and loves them completely still. And now I want to pray for those of us who find ourselves in the safety corner. That is, we find ourselves just withdrawing from things we know we're supposed to do, risks we know we're supposed to take, and we find ourselves just backing off, not acting, not risking. And if that applies to you, you're welcome to stand. And I want to pray for you. Jesus, I'm standing because I've been in that corner a lot. I've withdrawn from other people. I've not done things I knew I was supposed to do. I've been afraid to take risks. And I'm so grateful that you, who could have stayed very God in heaven, instead you emptied yourself and you came and you lived among us, and you meet us even in our corner of safety. And you're so compassionate towards us. You understand why we're afraid to act and afraid to risk. And I just see you being willing to grab each of us, hold each of us by the hand, and lead us away from this corner. And lead us toward the places where we're really called to act and risk. And thank you that as we step out of the safety that we sometimes retreat into, that you are totally there, totally available, totally willing to bless us. And you're so thrilled when any of us take even the smallest of steps away from safety. I think about a little baby who's about to learn how to walk, and this baby has been kept so safe, and now he's going to take an act. He's going to risk. He's going to fall down and get hurt sometimes. But his parents are so thrilled when he's willing to take a risk and try something. And I pray that my friends and I myself would sense your presence with us as we step out of safety. And now I want to pray for those of us who find ourselves up and to the left. That is, we're looking for authority without vulnerability. So if you have benefited from injustice, if you've kind of been one of those people who's claimed that, and other people have suffered maybe because of that, or if you've pursued an idol that promises you authority without vulnerability, and you want Jesus to rescue you from that before it takes your life, I invite you to stand with me. When we come to this corner, Jesus, we really do come to the heart of the story, of how the story went wrong. And thank you that, first of all, thank you that you are angry at our idols and our injustice, that you don't overlook it. And you're not indifferent because you see how damaging they could be and how damaging they are. But God, thank you that you want to rescue us before the idols take us. And that you intervene in the world in all sorts of ways to save us from our idols. God, I thank you that you have saved me from so many idols that would have taken my life. And God, I pray for everyone who's in this room who knows that there's something that's disrupting their relationships, that's becoming impatient, that's making increasing demands, that's not delivering real life. I pray that they would be able to turn from their idols and turn to you, and probably turn to a friend sometime in the next few days and confess it to a person and get prayed for one-on-one. And I pray that you would deliver us into real image bearing that's a lot harder but a lot better than these stupid, inanimate, impersonal things that we've been trying to build our lives around. Thank you that you met the idols and the forces of injustice at the cross and you defeated them. The lies that they tell us cannot have power over us if we listen to your voice. And you have risen from the grave to conquer all these false gods and to make us truly like you, the true God. So help us repent of our idols and our injustice in that hope. So I'm going to conclude my prayer now. God, thank you that you've called all of us up into the right, into image bearing. And I pray that you would, in the lives of every person in this room, call us to the true authority and true vulnerability for which we are made. And I close this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So we can bring the lights back up. Let me just tell you a quick story about Sonia. So Sonia was the girl in the middle. And a year before I met her, she'd been rolling BBs, rolling cigarettes. But now she was free. World Vision had been working for 10 years to set her free from slavery. And now she was free. So I got to talk with her through a translator, and she was, 13 years old maybe. And I said, well, let's see, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Sonia said, I want to be a doctor, because we don't have any doctors in my village. So I'm going to go away to school, learn medicine, come back and be a doctor, which I thought was an awesome answer. So you can pray for Sonia that she will have her dream of being a doctor. She's roughly your age now. And then I asked her, I was trying to think what else to talk about. I said, well, let's see. What do you like to do after school? Like, what do you and your friends do after school once you've done your homework? And I was expecting, I don't know, like play games or something. And she said something I never expected to hear. She said, oh, we free slaves. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, there are still about, she didn't say this, but about 10% of the kids in this district were still in slavery. So she said there are a lot of kids in our district who still are slaves. So after school, my friends and I go, and what was amazing is she said, first we go to the moneylender. So these powerful men in these communities who've been exploiting people, these girls were going to the moneylender, and they were saying, what you're doing is illegal. You could be thrown in jail if you don't stop. And this was actually true now. The law was now being enforced. And so they would go to the moneylender and say, you have to let these kids go. And then she said, then we go to the children, and we say, you do not have to stay here. You are free to go. You can come with us to school tomorrow. We'll get you a uniform. They all wear school uniforms. You can come with us to school. You're not a slave anymore. You're free. I realized I had just met my first 13-year-old abolitionist. We free slaves. I told Jaikumar this on the train on the way home, and he burst into his grin and he said, I am so thrilled she said that. He said, because now I know that World Vision can leave this village. He said, because she didn't say World Vision frees slaves. That would have been outside paternalism, like someone else is taking authority and doing something for poor people. He said, no, now she's bearing the image. And I think that's a great way that I want to conclude my time with you. What is our mission? What are we in the world to do? We free slaves. So let me just give you this. I feel obligated under the terms of my contract to tell you the answer to 3 questions that I start out with. You're sent into the world the same way Jesus was sent. The first thing you're sent to do is to bear the image. Remember I said at the beginning last night, what am I meant to be? You are meant to bear the image in the world, to bring order and abundance into the world, to live with authority and vulnerability in the world. And then you, as a follower of Jesus, have the power through the Holy Spirit to go out and restore the image. You can be part of freeing people who are slaves to idolatry and injustice. And then, that little question, what should I do? Like, what work should I do? Do whatever. Whatever. Paul says in Colossians 3, whatever you do, Work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. You know what? If you bear the image and restore the image, I don't know what you're going to do with your life. In a way, it doesn't matter. If you are in the world to bear the image and restore your image, whatever you do, you can do in a way that brings flourishing to the world. That can be your story. It ultimately won't be your story. It'll be the story of God working in you. So, thank you for letting me spend this time with you.